For the battered but proud people of the Empire State, from the financial and entertainment epicenter of New York City to the sleeping and empty small cities and towns of upstate, which once bustled with manufacturing, mining, and farming. We all know from inspiration, history, and nature, we deserve a return to the success and growth of generations past, a birthright being squandered by corruption in Albany, and the depredations of an insecure, scheming mountebank posing as governor, who loathes both us and himself. As liberty beckoned to enslaved peoples behind the Iron Curtain via American broadcasts after World War II, we now say, believe, rise, and join us. Welcome to Radio Free New York.
Hey guys, welcome to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister, and today I'm not in studio with Bob, but I am remote, and I've got Kevin remote from the Liberty Closet as well.
Hello.
So today we've got an interesting topic to cover. There's a lot to talk about here, and this is something that I think doesn't get a lot of discussion. It's not something that you're hearing about very often in mainstream media, and to be honest, it's a topic that I know just enough to be dangerous about, but thankfully Kevin is the one who really knows this issue inside and out, and today being Talk of the Town, this issue is a big issue for, I think, everyone across the United States. This is an issue that's impacted us federally. I would say it impacts us on the state level and the local level as well. And that is how government has historically furthered segregation in the country through things like programs, various loans backed by the federal government. And I would go as far to even say things like zoning, which I'm not sure if we'll make it that far, not today. But Kevin, why don't you just lead us off with this topic and kind of set the stage?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I've been thinking about for a while, and you know, I think about how segregation still exists in the United States, still exists, particularly in the city of Rochester, where I live and you live as well, and what caused that condition to happen? Because first of all, there's a segment of people who think that segregation isn't a thing anymore, that's not in existence, that we eliminated segregation back in the 1960s, and now everyone is fine and good and happy. But the fact of the matter is that segregation is still a reality in many cities, not just across the South, but also very much so in the North as well. And segregation ends up having the effect of neighborhoods where there are huge concentrations of poverty, there are lack of government services, and by that I mean too is that the government doesn't maintain the areas where there's high concentrations of minority population. They don't put as many resources into maintaining roads, trees, pipe infrastructure, things like that. So like there are very real, tangible problems with how the government spends its money based on the racial makeup of neighborhoods. And so you can look at the data and you can see that. And one of the big things about segregation is that, especially what I hear on the left, is that segregation is merely a matter of private choices, right? That segregation is an aggregation of a lot of choices, particularly among white Americans, to exclude African Americans from their neighborhoods and to redline neighborhoods and push people. And then so it's a reality of choices made by, again, homeowners in these neighborhoods and banks and real estate agents and things like that. And that's certainly part of the story. Like, for sure, that is definitely what had happened. But what gets ignored in a lot of this discussion is how local, sometimes state, but not so much as the state, but especially local and federal government policies drove this reality, that segregation as it exists way back in the mid 20th century and as it still exists today was largely a product not just of private choices but also of government choices. Because again, for the progressives, it's easy to say, look, if we let people have the freedom and don't get the government involved in housing desegregation, then what will end up happening is that you end up with segregation. That's the reality of having too much liberty. But that's a myth. The fact is that is the government that has caused a lot of the segregation that still exists today. It is a result of policies that were explicitly racist that continue to have longstanding effects on the racial makeup of neighborhoods and cities, including Rochester, where both of us live.
Yeah,
What are your
and I
thoughts
would
so
I
far?
would say I definitely like hear this very often, especially in the city. You hear leftists say things along the lines of, there is racism, there is segregation, and they normally point at the right and they say, well, it's all the people on the right, it's them personally, it's them individually. These people are racist and they're doing racist things, and their answer to that is usually, we need government to be big. We need government to be powerful. We need government to take away people's choice and liberty and speech and all these things. And then if we do that, there won't be racism. There won't be segregation. But in reality, when you look at the numbers, you see that the bigger government gets and the more government control there is, the more expanded segregation becomes due to public policies, government policies that actually further segregation.
Yeah, right. And what I hear all the time, especially not on this show, but especially when I'm talking with, progressive types, like, oh, you as a libertarian, you just don't want the government to do anything. And again, you're the cause of these problems. That if we don't get the government to intervene in this process, that somehow segregation will get worse. But again, the fact of the matter is that a government that's big enough to try to address and like do social engineering to fix these problems, if in the hands of the wrong people, is also big enough to cause these problems, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, and this isn't like a new thing either. Like if you look at the history of government, government has been the driving force of segregation since the beginning of our country. Through various laws that literally openly promoted segregation, and then as those laws were repealed, government just kind of used loopholes to affect these same policies.
Yeah, right, exactly. And again, I always think, like in the Reconstruction South, as the Southern government started implementing these like explicitly segregationist policies, and even in the post-Civil War North as well, this is a de jure, form of segregation and discrimination that impacted people. And again, I understand like the need to address like the private racism part of that, but like I don't I get frustrated when progressives ignore the government's role in this, right? And they kind of write that off as like, oh, well, that's just like a government manifestation of that private racism. But like, no, when you put these tools in place to try to social engineer things, like you end up with negative consequences. And some of the results of even well-intentioned policies ends up perpetuating the same segregation as well. And I hope to be able to get to some of that later in the show.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good point to bring up too, is this idea of, or at least my opinion is, you can never eliminate private racism. You can't force a human being to not be racist. You can go through and try to show them how racism is wrong and how people are people, but if that person is racist, they're probably going to continue to be racist. However, we do have the ability to change racism in our system, in our government, and to eliminate those policies and programs that create racism, that create segregation. And it's a matter of doing that, and not so much a matter of trying to restrict private individuals, because you're never going to change them, whether they're publicly racist or privately racist in their home. That piece isn't going to change.
Right, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to try to like encourage people to not be racist. Like I don't think either of us are saying that, but when the government tries to implement ham-fisted solutions to this, like it ends up not being as effective as people think it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are people who have been very successful in going out and meeting with organizations that are just flat out racist, and showing them that, hey, like, I'm a person too, and have been able to sway individuals' views on that. But I think that that's a role of a community working together to make those changes. Government has not successfully made those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, there it is. I'm like, I know the break's coming up soon, so I suppose we'll talk about this more after.
Yep. So we're going to take a brief break here on Radio Free New York. When we come back, we're going to discuss some of the programs that have driven this segregation on a federal level and a state level. We'll talk about that when we come back on Radio Free New York.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at SimpleTech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored for any issues, keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whatever your business IT needs are, SimpleTech Innovations should be your first call. They've won the Best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. SimpleTech Innovations.
If you're looking to market and grow your business, make new business connections, and give back to the community in a meaningful way, consider joining the Greece Regional Chamber of Commerce. We're the largest suburban chamber in Monroe County, and we offer networking, education, marketing, insurance, and advocacy. You do not need to live or work in Greece to join. Our members come from throughout the region. In short, we're better together, and together, we're moving business forward. Visit greecechamber.org or call 585-227-7272 to join today.
Tom Walls started in 1955. Since then, America has been through wars, natural disasters, and economic highs and lows. Rochester companies have had their ups and downs, but one constant, Tom Walls. Tom Walls has stood the test of time. A Wahlburger and a frosted mug of root beer on a sunny afternoon brings us closer to our past and reminds us of what is good. My name is Riley. I am Tom Walls.
Share the good times. Tom Walls.
Why do businesses choose to move their website from Wix and Squarespace to SimpleTech Innovations? Maybe it's their excellent customer service or attention to detail. Maybe it's their ability to give a truly customized solution. Or perhaps they just like the fact that SimpleTech is a local small business that builds great relationships with its clients. Whatever the reason may be, you can rest assured knowing that the local team at SimpleTech has your best interest in mind when building or updating your website. They're hands-on and love helping customers achieve their goals. But don't take my word for it. They've won the Best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. If your website doesn't match your dreams or isn't achieving your goals, give the professionals at SimpleTech Innovations a call today for a consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. SimpleTech Innovations.
You're listening to Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. I've got Kevin tuned in here live, helping me out with the show today. And what we're talking about is we're talking about how government policies, federal, state, local policies, have driven segregation over the years. And I've got a comment here on YouTube, and I want to welcome you guys to join us in this discussion. Feel free to give us a call. Call into the station. The number is 585-346-3000. Once again, that's 585-346-3000. Or you can hop over on Facebook or YouTube, search Andrew C. Hollister. You can pull up this feed live, comment right there live, and it will come over here to my screen, and I can see your comments. I try to check them during the break. And Garrett on YouTube says that zoning, central planning, occupational licensing, the drug war, and the welfare state, all progressive big government policies that maintain segregation and racism. And I actually agree with that statement, and I hope that we're going to hit all of those today. Yeah. And I'm going to let Kevin kind of lead in with, the first policy that we're going to talk about today that's driving this segregation.
Yeah, absolutely, Garrett. You're spot on with those observations. I'm not sure that we're going to get to all those today, but yeah, those are definitely some of the ways in which federal government policy, progressive policy, in many of those cases, ends up hurting people and perpetuating segregation and perpetuating racial disparities in wealth and in racial disparities in the criminal justice system as well. But as it relates to housing policy, the federal government started getting into the housing a lot more in the 1930s, right in the thick of the Great Depression. And FDR, uh, he when he was creating the New Deal, when he was creating the Public Works Administration, one of the things that they did is they tried to clean up neighborhoods. That's the way they phrased it, right? This is kind of like the early stages of urban renewal, which ended up destroying mostly African American communities throughout the United States and replacing it with sometimes highways, sometimes with new housing, often single family housing, things like that. But what they tried to do is in the 1920s and 30s, throughout the country, a lot of the neighborhoods were integrated. Right, African Americans would live amongst working class white Americans in a lot of these neighborhoods, and so they were living there is fine. That's what the situation was. Like, again, without government enforced segregation, there were integrated neighborhoods. And not to say that there weren't any issues with that in these, usually low income neighborhoods, but they did exist. And so what the federal government solution to that was is that they would destroy what they called slums, and then they would build public housing projects. And a lot of the public housing projects, they would, destroy these slums, and then they would build a public housing unit, and it would be for whites only. That was the explicit policy of the federal government at the time, was to fund these federal housing projects, and they would only allow white people to live in them. And I'm
Oh,
just gonna
sorry.
keep going. Yeah, I was like, I didn't know if you had any comment on that. I thought I heard you say something.
I had my mic muted here, so
Okay, gotcha.
sorry about that.
It's
so
hard.
I
I
want-
can't. We gotta get the video set up so I can like give you a look. Because I thought I heard you say something, but without us in studio, it's hard to see like when you're getting ready to say something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when you say these policies were explicitly racist and said, white people only, I mean, was that like the language in the law that said like only white people can qualify for this, or did they use like certain qualifiers that they just knew only white people would be able to obtain?
Yeah, so in these early days, it was explicitly racist. Like it was like whites only. And so what they did is here's what would end up happening, is they would say, well, in order to adapt to the culture of the South or adapt to the culture of the cities that they're building in, and to maintain racial harmony, the government said, well, we're going to create segregated buildings because we don't want to create conflict by having integrated buildings. So again, it was presented as like this is a way to promote safety and peace in neighborhoods, is by segregating housing. So these neighborhoods would get raised, and then a new public housing project would get built, and they would say, well, this one's for whites only, and they would build other public housing projects for African Americans. And sometimes they would build them far away, or sometimes they would build them in what the federal government would describe as declining neighborhoods. And they would do different things to, again, promote racial harmony. And what that ended up happening is with all the public housing projects, when people were struggling to be able to find and maintain homes in the Depression of the 1930s, they would fund these systems that would end up splitting what would otherwise be integrated neighborhoods and again, creating segregated housing.
Yeah, so I mean that to me is, if you look at what government is doing today, it's not so different, right? Because what do we hear often? Oh, government needs to do this policy, government needs to do this program, government needs to do this whatever, for what? For safety. So it sounds like one of the big things are like, yeah, things will be safer if we segregate people. It'll make things better for the neighborhood. And that's how they justified like legitimately racist segregating programs.
Yeah, and again, this wasn't a thing that was just in the South either. This was all across the country. These projects were built, in Rochester, in Chicago, in Portland, Oregon, in Seattle, and San Francisco. All across the country, they would build these things and create totally separate neighborhoods for white people and for black people. So that's how it ended up happening. Again, that was just in the 1930s too. So that's just the start of these policies, and things started to shift a bit after post World War II. What we kind of think of during post World War II, right? Is we think of the GIs coming home and they're able to go and use the assistance from the federal government to go out and buy homes out in the suburbs. We think of things like Levittown. You familiar with that?
No. But share with the class, Kevin. Come on.
Okay, great. So I know I could get ahead of myself sometimes with some of this stuff, but again, like Levittown's like one of the famous like suburbs that people built up very quickly, and they had these small single family homes that were a little bit outside the city. They was presented as a good place to raise a family, things like that. And the federal government would provide assistance for these returning GIs to be able to afford these houses. Now, there are two issues with that. One is that the assistance would be very difficult to come by for African Americans, like just written into the approval of things like the Federal Housing Authority loans, things like that. So again, that's a subsidized and guaranteed loan given to people who are trying to buy a house. In fact, I have an FHA loan. The program is still around. It just makes it a bit easier to be able to afford a house because a bank, and for better or worse, there's bigger issues with this project than what's listed here. But this type of loan would mean that a bank wouldn't necessarily lose as much money if you were to default on this loan. Again, that's what it means to be federally guaranteed. But the catch is that the Federal Housing Authority didn't want to guarantee these loans in neighborhoods that weren't considered good investments, right?
Okay.
And so what do you think that
So the
means?
government sat there and said, we'll back these loans in these wealthier neighborhoods, which were typically going to be white neighborhoods, but these other neighborhoods that seemed undesirable, which were full of minorities, are like, no, that's too risky. We won't do that. And essentially what that did is that made it so that minorities and black people couldn't get these federally backed loans. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. And and this is part of the thing where zoning things come in, local laws come in, and like private discrimination comes in, right? Is that they wouldn't in this program explicitly say like you can't participate in this program if you're African American, but realtors by both culture and sometimes by law weren't allowed to show African Americans homes in white neighborhoods. Like they just wouldn't do it. They would get run out. Realtors would get run out of town for doing it. And there's a great long form article in the Democrat Chronicle that I will share. It is paywalled, so you have to be a subscriber to see it, but it's very good if you are a subscriber to that. But it shows like a map of the city of Rochester, and you'll see like literally neighborhoods that are red lines. You'll see that they're little red boxes in the northeast part of Rochester, and then you'll see some that are yellow. So red was considered dangerous, bad investment. Yellow was considered like kind of declining area, and then you have like green and blue, which is considered a safe investment area. Again, so in banks didn't want to give out loans in those red areas because the federal government wouldn't guarantee those loans, and even if you could get a private loan, because some people do, a mortgage directly through the banks, but the banks still wouldn't do that, and the federal government wasn't backing it. So it's again, it kind of gets mixed up in both federal government policy and like the kind of private racism that existed and sometimes still exists today with that type of stuff. But again, if you were African American and you're maybe a wealthy business owner and you wanted to go live in Brighton, a lot of times, or Rondequoit, a lot of times the realtors wouldn't show you homes in that area. The neighborhood would create restrictions to keep African American people from buying homes in that area. There'd be protests and petitions. So the only place that the realtors would show are in the African American neighborhoods. And
yeah, that actually leads into the thing that I hope we'll bring up in the second half of the show, is how zoning kind of does the same thing. And neighborhood associations today are still pushing for zoning that essentially forces minorities out of the neighborhoods or doesn't make it possible for them to move in. So we're going to talk about this and more when we come back from our break on Radio Free New York.
Now, more than twice the power.
WYSL.
More powerful FM 92.1, FM 95.5 West, and 1040 AM WYSL Avon Rochester.
Here's the latest forecast from the News 10 NBC Weather Center for tonight. We'll have mostly cloudy skies, a couple of snow showers. Turning a bit colder, we'll drop into the 20s. On your Wednesday, sun and clouds, brisk and cold with some lake effect snow showers. A little fluffy inch or two is possible with temperatures in the 20s and low 30s. Colder with maybe a few squalls on Thursday, especially near Route 104. Temperatures in the teens and 20s. I'm Rich Cornelia, WYSL.
Shopping for a used car, but hate that uncomfortable feeling you get not knowing anything about its history? Well, here's how Patrick Buick GMC can help. It's simple, and it's called Upfront Used Cars. A complete history report, a recall check, all upfront on our website with full descriptions, photos, and internet sale pricing. And every price on our website matches the used car on our lot. Patrick's Used Car Supercenter puts it all up front. Every windshield has a detailed checklist showing tire tread depth, brake pad thickness. You get the picture. Check out our certified pre-owned selection and get the remainder of a 6-year, 100,000-mile limited powertrain warranty. Everything's up front at PatrickBuickGMC.com. Patrick, just off 390 exit 12, corner of Lehigh Station and West Henrietta Road. Upfront used cars, exclusively at Patrick Buick GMC in Henrietta.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at Simple Tech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored for any issues, keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whenever your business IT needs are, Simple Tech Innovation should be your first call. They've won the best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. Simple Tech Innovations.
Imani, time for school, baby. Imani, time for school. Imani, it's time.
A different couch, a different floor, the backseat of a car. Over 2,000 Rochester school-aged children are homeless, but now there is hope. The Open Door Mission Cold Water House for moms and their children. OpenDoorMission.com/doves.
Come home to calm, quiet, and beautiful Woodgate Apartments and Townhomes in Spencerport. Just minutes from downtown Rochester. Choose from 1 or 2 bedroom apartments or 2 or 3 bedroom 2-floor townhomes in an historic canal village featuring nearby restaurants and shopping. You'll appreciate the balconies, patios, and beautiful pool. The townhomes include an attached garage. Come take a tour and meet our friendly and knowledgeable on-site staff, Cedar Circle in Spencerport, or visit WoodgatePlaceAPTS.com to learn more.
At Family Furniture in Perry, get everyday savings without big chain store hassles. Find out why Family Furniture is the shopping destination for thousands all over the region. For the best prices, quality, and selection on name brand sofas, bedroom and dining groups, recliners, and motion furniture. You'll also find great financing deals for qualified buyers and quick, convenient delivery. Family Furniture in downtown Perry, serving you for over 70 years. Open Monday and Tuesday till 5:30, Wednesday till 12:30, Thursday and Friday nights till 7, Saturdays till 4.
An experienced professional with more than 15 years in dentistry, Dr. David Olivo welcomes new patients to his family practice at 2005 Lyle Avenue. At the office of Dr. Olivo, you'll discover a warm and comforting environment staffed by professionals who are committed to providing the best available dental care while assuring your complete comfort. Call 328-3382 for an appointment. Dr. David Olivo, offering quality dentistry with a gentle touch.
Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. We're talking about how government policies have furthered segregation across the United States. In some cases, this is extremely explicit, where they literally said, hey, this program you need to be white to qualify for. And in other ways, it's a little more hidden because they just they choose neighborhoods that they know are, you know, don't have minority groups in them, or they make the requirements in a way that they know that minorities, by, you know, for the most part, won't be able to qualify. So that's what we're talking about here today. I know one of the ways that this is done is through zoning. Kevin, I don't know if you want to start with zoning or if you want to start with something else.
Well, let me just underscore the type of language that the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, would use in these things, because I just want to wrap up that point, because I found the quote from the FHA underwriting manual that was given out to real estate and loan assessors, and it said that they needed vigilance against adverse influences upon neighborhood stability. And I'll quote from that. It says, generally, a high rating should only be given only where adequate and enforced zoning regulations exist, or where effective restricted covenants are recorded against the entire tract, since they provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. And so it says restrictions should prohibit the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. So explicitly racist. Say, like, if you don't have racist zoning laws and you don't have like covenants that say you're not allowed to sell this home to an African American, like in this neighborhood, which is something that existed and in fact is still written in some Rochester deeds. There's an interesting story about that the FHA would advise against underwriting and giving loans to homes in that area.
Yeah, that's so. Do you have a date on that manual, and if it's still in circulation today?
I don't believe it's in circulation today. I think like since then the manual has been updated, and there are new laws that explicitly say the opposite of this, that if there are discriminatory practices in bank loans, that the federal government won't guarantee those loans.
Yeah. You know, this brings up something that I see very often in discussion on social media, and sometimes you hear it, you know, out in public too, where somebody will suggest that something happens, and you know, it could be anything, and the person says something along the lines of, "Well, is that right? Is that okay?" And the person will respond, "Well, it's legal." And society has this idea that legality must equal morality. Or sometimes they'll ask the question, is that legal? And the premise is that law must be moral, and if it's legal, it must be okay. But that's definitely not the case. And we can totally see that here with these type of policies, that legality does not equal morality. It doesn't mean that it's okay just because it's legal. And we certainly have like corrupt elected officials who pass immoral laws all the time. And looking at something and asking if it's legal is not a good gauge of morality at all.
No, one isn't a substitute for the other. And in fact, you know, groups of people can get together and get the government to create a law that uses force for explicitly immoral ends. You know, that's what happened in this case, and that's what's happened in a lot of other cases as well. Legality is not the same. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's moral.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important to bring up as a very good argument as to why government should be smaller. Because where we're going and where we have been for a long time is government has grown to the point where it can act on immoral things and have immoral programs operating, and it essentially allows for government to do these things because we've allowed these programs to exist. We've allowed government to get big enough where it can offer these type of programs. Government wouldn't be able to enforce and create additional segregation if it was so small it couldn't create the program to begin with.
Right, and it's funny because I certainly agree with you in that, but again, we often hear the opposite argument from people. Again, and as we kind of talked about at the beginning of this show, is that well, if we don't have a strong federal government here to prevent these types of things, and we just let the free market run wild, we will end up with segregation and racial discrimination that's totally unchecked. But what we can see from history is that often it was the government that was enacting these policies, and it's not the still very damaging nature of private discrimination, but it was with the full force law and budget of the federal government putting these policies into place based on what they would describe as benign social engineering, but what we clearly see today has enormous destructive effects that we're still trying to deal with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that people who say that there's no such thing as systemic racism have probably weren't aware of these type of policies. They probably weren't aware that some of these things were actually written in as law, and that racism definitely exists in government policies and makes it worse.
Yeah, and again, we still see some of this stuff today too. When I say my particular version of kind of small government libertarianism, I say that my goal is to end these things. I share some of these goals with the progressives sometimes their goals are really bad, but in terms of ending racism, look, if we're serious about doing this, let's start with dismantling some of these policies that are still in place that enforce segregation or try to socially engineer certain makeups of neighborhoods and things like that end up being far more destructive and take choice away from people, and again, they don't actually solve the problem. It just costs us a lot of money and causes a lot of harm in the end.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So do we have a couple examples of some of these programs that maybe exist today, whether in full swing or partial effect, that we should be addressing, we should be looking at, and we should be talking about and educating people on?
Yeah, so I'd say the federal government housing stuff that we had talked about that mostly started going away in the 60s and 70s. And now there's still some issues with kind of private company discrimination that sometimes ends up happening, and that's what you'll see progressive point to. But a lot of times the struggle ends up being on zoning, as you kind of indicated in the last segment, and that happens more on the local level. And what that'll take the form of is it's again not explicitly racist, but sometimes you'll have places where you have a lot of single family housing. Again, stuff that's been subsidized by both the federal, the state, and the local government. They built these neighborhoods based on these programs that had at the time explicitly racist intent, and they were there to be white enclaves again that were subsidized and allow the predominantly white families who lived in those neighborhoods to be able to build wealth. And now they have zoning restrictions that prevent people from different income brackets to be able to move in. So even if you have a private developer who has a bunch of land and they say, well, I want to be able to build apartments in this area, and I intend this to be for people who make between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. What will happen is that the local governments will get together and neighborhood groups will get together and they'll try to stop that development. And again, because of the income disparity that does exist between African Americans, sometimes that there's a fear that would apartment building would end up being more racially diverse than what people are used to. So it's never usually said out loud. But sometimes it is the case that by virtue of what they end up accomplishing, you end up continuing to enforce segregation. And the only places where low income housing is able to be built is in urban areas, and we end up perpetuating segregation through local zoning law.
Yeah, so the thought is people say, "Oh, I don't want low income housing in my neighborhood because," and there's a negative connotation with that, right? People think,
Right.
"Oh, it's going to bring in crime and undesirable people," and what they're really saying is it's going to bring in people differently than me or different than me that I don't want around.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to necessarily put that bad intention on everyone, but the
Mhm.
actual consequence of that policy is that you end up with further segregation because you end up kind of with these stagnant neighborhoods that you're not getting people to get outsiders in, and then you do have the issue of sometimes banks well, oftentimes banks do have a higher rate of rejection for African Americans for some of these neighborhoods still, even though these policies aren't really around anymore. There's still kind of that legacy of redlining that still exists. And, and that's one of those tough questions. I'm not sure what the government's response should be to that, if any, or if it's just a matter of educating people. But again, I don't want to put the bad intention necessarily on that, on the people who don't want apartment buildings in their neighborhood. Maybe that isn't what they're thinking. But again, the outcome is more important than what their intention is or isn't.
Sure. Yeah, so we're going to take our last break of the hour. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how zoning prevents jobs from entering poor neighborhoods, and that causes a lot of problems,
yeah.
which also increases segregation. So we'll talk about that when we come back on Radio Free New York.
Why do businesses choose to move their website from Wix and Squarespace to SimpleTech Innovations? Maybe it's their excellent customer service or attention to detail. Maybe it's their ability to give a truly customized solution. Or perhaps they just like the fact that SimpleTech is a local small business that builds great relationships with its clients. Whatever the reason may be, you can rest assured knowing that the local team at SimpleTech has your best interest in mind when building or updating your website. They're hands-on and love helping customers achieve their goals. But don't take my word for it. They've won the best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. If your website doesn't match your dreams or isn't achieving your goals, give the professionals at SimpleTech Innovations a call today for a consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. SimpleTech Innovations.
Aircraft Environmental Systems proudly supports Radio Free New York. Rochester-based leaders in climate simulation chambers for America's R&D laboratories. We're experts in troubleshooting, calibrations, custom designs, and consulting for more than 40 years. Industry pioneers, we created the first ever fleet of temperature, humidity, and altitude test chambers available to rent coast to coast. Trained and trusted by environmental chamber manufacturers, we are ACES. Find us at acesinc.com.
Human trafficking is when someone is being forced, tricked, or coerced to engage in a sex trade or forced labor. If you're a kid and forced to sell sex, drugs, or work against your will, that's trafficking. You're not a criminal, and there is help available. Call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888 or text Be Free. Sponsored by the Livingston County Safe Harbors Human Trafficking Task Force.
Your business relies on computers and technology to operate. Slow, unreliable networks and servers can cause unplanned downtime and affect your bottom line. The experts at SimpleTech Innovations are here to help. Their preventative maintenance program ensures that your computers and network are kept up to date and monitored for any issues, keeping your business running smoothly. They also help clients achieve HIPAA, PCI, and New York State cybersecurity compliance to keep your network safe and secure. Whatever your business IT needs are, SimpleTech Innovation should be your first call. They've won the best in Rochester 8 years in a row and have an A+ Better Business Bureau rating. Call them today for a free consultation at 585-200-3182. That's 585-200-3182. SimpleTech Innovations.
Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister. Today is our Talk of the Town, and I've got Kevin Wilson with me. We're talking about how government policies have furthered segregation over the years, and we've landed on the topic of zoning. And I know some of you are thinking, like, how could zoning possibly further segregation? And it's pretty interesting. I've read some articles and seen some cities where they take their zoning map and then they overlay it over the a map of their urban centers that show their poverty limits, and they line up like almost an exact copy. And one of the things that you can't help but talk about is how zoning prevents jobs from coming into poor communities. I know Kevin loves talking about zoning, so I'll
I
let you
sure
go ahead
do.
and take it from here, Kevin. But this I think is actually a big issue that a lot of communities face, and they don't even realize they're facing it.
It is, and there are two separate things going here. One is about housing, one is about business development, and I just want to touch on the housing thing really quick because it's interesting that the Trump administration, under Ben Carson, who is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, is working on like the way in which zoning policy is implemented in a lot of areas, and tying that to federal government subsidies for housing. So if you have like discriminatory zoning policies in either housing or in business zoning too, then you may not get these federal government subsidies for like housing projects, which is interesting. So that's again coming out of the Trump administration. But I sort of agree with what it is. I mean, I don't know how I feel about housing subsidies in general, but this may
I
be
know how I
better
feel
than.
about them.
Yeah, yeah, I'm being glib about it. Yeah, I
Sure.
don't generally like them at all. So we should cut them, but at the local level, the way a lot of zoning practices end up working out is that instead of you being able to, what zoning is what you're allowed to do in your neighborhood, right? So the city or the town or whatever will overlay these maps to say, okay, in this section you can only build single family housing. In this section you could build single family housing or apartments of up to 5 units. In this section you can build apartments of up to 30 units. In this section you're allowed to have manufacturing. In this section, you're allowed to have small businesses like convenience stores. And what will end up happening in a lot of these places is that, like, you end up with vast wastelands. Well, not wastelands. It's all single-family housing because we've decided to separate the uses in these cities. So housing will be separate from the commercial districts. So people, this ends up happening, especially in poor neighborhoods, is people don't have the ability to be able to start a business out of their home, or they don't have the ability to start a business on the first floor of an apartment building that maybe they own or lease, and it prevents job opportunities, particularly for people who don't have the transportation options to be able to go travel out to the suburbs or travel across the city to be able to find a job. They could create a job right in their own backyard, but local government policy prevents that. And again, a lot of
And
times,
one other
yeah,
thing
go
to
ahead.
add here too, when people talk about zoning, they always sound like they have the best intentions, right? They say, well, we want this zoned residential because, and I hear this like reason used all the time. They say, well, you don't want an auto shop next to your house running an air hammer all day, or you don't want a manufacturing company making all this noise, and polluting the noise in your neighborhood. So that's our justification for zoning. We'll just move them far away so that you don't have to worry about it. When realistically speaking, there's other ways to resolve those problems, and it pushes jobs as far away from the community as possible.
Yeah, it pushes them out and it prevents, jobs from being able to happen in your neighborhood. And if you have to travel further from work, sometimes the value of your home in that neighborhood drops. And again, you're not able to go and access those jobs or create, be an entrepreneur and create those jobs yourself. And again, what zoning is it's a local restriction on the ability to be able to own and operate a business. That's all it is. And I sometimes I get some pushback from like my more conservative and Republican friends that when I talk about zoning, I'm like, whoa, look, man, this is a government restriction. Like, don't we want to remove restrictions on starting small businesses? I thought you were all about that. And and that's one of the ways in which we have to start. And it also has the side benefit among people who are progressives that it is easier and better for people in areas where there are concentrations of minority populations to be able to start businesses and be able to not have to have as expensive transportation options to be able to get to some of these jobs.
So we can't talk about all this, I think, without talking about a really simple solution, which is mixed use, right?
Oh yeah.
The ability for somebody to live in a residential area and maybe conduct commerce or something like that out of their home, or maybe, it's one of those setups where there's two storefronts on the bottom and a couple apartments up top or something like that, and allowing that type of mixed residential and light commercial set up to help communities have not just jobs, but also access to basic things like food, for example, groceries,
right.
that sort of thing right in their community instead of needing transportation to get far away to it.
Yeah, right, and that's a good point too. It's like, food is an important part of, like, quality of life in a neighborhood, and if you prevent stores from being able to open your neighborhood, then you're going to have to be able to travel much further to get good, healthy food, or you're going to have limited options with the few places that are allowed to operate in your neighborhood. And so the solution is again to make it easier for people to do these things. There are loan policies, both from like the federal government and business loan standpoint, that kind of discourage these mixed use buildings from going up right now. And I think the winds are starting to shift on that a bit. But again, we have to think about how did federal, state, and local government policy create the neighborhoods that we live in now? And is it a good thing that we have created policy that makes the neighborhoods look the way they are now?
Yeah, and I would throw out there too, because I'm sure some people are thinking, they're wondering, what does this look like? Is there, anything that we could show as success for these type of neighborhoods? And my fallback is always neighborhoods like looking at Park Ave, looking at Culver, looking at East Ave, where you've mixed residential with accessibility to jobs, convenience, food, like all of these things. And these neighborhoods are doing really well. They're some of the most desired areas in the city, and people being there is good for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a great thing. And I'll say something about that because I know like someone's thinking it or is like typing it right now, like, well, I don't want to live in Park Nap neighborhood. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. I get that it's not for everybody. I live in the city and I like it and I like being able to walk to stuff. Okay, fine. The only thing I ask is that we erode subsidies for living like way out in the suburbs, because again, the way we have things shaped right now is that the federal government and the state government like kind of subsidizes sprawl, and that's kind of a whole other issue. But my default is, what would the world actually look like if we didn't subsidize and try to control and shape the way our neighborhoods are built right now? And we've talked about ways in which those government influences has resulted in segregation, and there's other ways in which we could talk about it. It decreases the quality of life, decreases access to jobs, makes transportation more difficult. I think the solution for me is like, well, get the government out of it and let's see what the free market does with this stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we could build a cool tagline around this, Kevin. I think
All
it
right.
should be something along the lines of like, get government out of segregation.
Oh boy. That'll grab some attention. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it would, and I think it actually furthers the conversation because I think people truly believe that government's not engaged in segregation, here in 2020. But the fact is, government is still engaged in segregation, whether we like it or not. And the only way to stop that is to get government out of it, get government out of these programs, out of these subsidies. And that's how we can fix this issue. Republicans, Democrats, the left and the right, everybody should be on board with this. Guys, you're listening to Radio Free New York. Catch us tomorrow for White House Wednesday.